members of the jury. Good evening. A good writer uses their words for the benefit of others. A good liar uses their words for their own benefit. It's interesting how one person's far-fetched lie can sometimes reveal the truth. I'd suggest to you that's exactly what we've seen happen in this case. We told you at the beginning of this case the truth would be revealed and that it would boil down to misinformation, misdirection, and Miss Thompson. Now, prosecution in this case has made a big deal out of the fact that Joe Mitchell's a writer and that he writes fiction. And they've told you he writes murder mysteries, and that's true. What they conveniently left out is he writes about other things as well. He also writes detective novels. But just like the fact that Joe Mitchell writes murder mysteries doesn't make him a murderer, and the fact that he writes detective novels doesn't make him a detective, the fact that he writes murder mysteries certainly doesn't make him a murderer. He might be a writer. Miss Thompson was the storyteller in this case. We're going to walk through the evidence. We're going to talk about the testimony that you've just heard today, and we're going to talk about why the prosecution has not met their burden to prove this case beyond all reasonable doubt. Miss Thompson's story, we can call it a story because that's what it is. Her story is that on September 10th, 2012, her stepdaughter, Leslie, went to the movies by herself, and that Joe Mitchell showed up to her house that night at 7:30. It's interesting. On one hand, Miss Thompson told you she was afraid that Joe might hurt Leslie, that she was afraid for Leslie's well-being in Joe's company. But that doesn't quite jive with what happened when Joe showed up to Miss Thompson's home that night. Miss Thompson told Joe exactly where Leslie was, that Leslie was at the movies. And she went even further and told Joe, oh, she'll be back around 10 o'clock. Come back then and come alone. We realized during her testimony things didn't quite add up. We can't rely on her story. And she says that later that night at 10 o'clock, she heard her doorbell ring. And she went to open that door, and Leslie was standing there, facing her. And then suddenly, in the dark, it was raining that night, from 36 feet away, Miss Thompson looked you in the eye and said, a white car came down the street and shot Leslie and sped off. I want to remind you of a photograph the prosecution showed you during the testimony of Officer Sliviak in this case. This is State's Exhibit 5. This is how Leslie landed when she was shot. Officer Sliviak took this picture when he arrived to 1751 Madison Avenue that night. Leslie's facing the door, isn't she? That bullet wound, Officer Sliviak told you, and the coroner's report tells you, that bullet entered Leslie from the front, exited the back of her body. She landed 6 inches away from the front door. That front door Miss Thompson opened when she heard Leslie come home. And Leslie was shot with a .38 caliber firearm, according to Officer Sliviak, a short-range firearm. Miss Thompson owns a .38 caliber firearm. She hasn't seen that gun since before Leslie's death. How convenient. And Miss Thompson's story is that after that vehicle sped off, neighbors came rushing to her side, rushed her in the house to comfort her. Where are those neighbors? Did we hear from them in this case? Not one person can corroborate Miss Thompson's story. we heard from 3 witnesses in this case who all corroborate Joe Mitchell's whereabouts on the night his wife was killed. You heard from Chris Ravina, Raleigh Porter, and Quinn Washington. Now, Quinn Washington, remember, was that ticket booth operator at the movie theater that Joe went to after Miss Thompson told him she was there. Quinn Washington talked with Joe, told him Leslie was in the movie theater, told him what time the movie was going to end. Joe bought a ticket. He didn't go see the movie. What's important is that Joe left, went to the Silver Dollar Bar, had some drinks, stopped at the gun shop. Chris Ravina told you that. Chris Ravina also told you how dark and rainy it was that night, and that his shop, the entryway to his shop to the street where Joe Mitchell had to park, was 36 feet. And that night it was so dark and rainy, he couldn't tell what kind of vehicle Joe Mitchell was in. He couldn't see Joe Mitchell coming. But he corroborates Joe Mitchell's account of where Joe Mitchell was the night his wife was killed. And the other thing that's important to remember, members of the jury, and we'll talk about the elephant in the room, the fact that Joe Mitchell picked up his gun that night, and coincidentally his wife was killed with a gunshot. Let's talk about it. We're not trying to hide anything here. Joe Mitchell had had his gun cleaned a week before, and that night, because the gun shop was on his way home, he picked it up, and it was around 9:40, 9:45 when he was at that gun shop. If he had wanted to hurt Leslie, Joe Mitchell had plenty of opportunity that night. He could have gone and waited for Leslie outside the movie theater. He didn't do that, did he? Instead, he goes to a bar, has drinks, drives around town. He had plenty of opportunity to hurt Leslie before she was at her front doorstep that night, where Miss Thompson was. He had plenty of opportunity to go to the gun shop before 9:40 at night if he wanted to do Leslie any harm, and he didn't do it. And not one person corroborates anything Miss Thompson has to say, not even the evidence. I want to tell you about Joe Mitchell. Joe Mitchell's parents died when he was 4. He was raised by his grandparents. When he was in high school, he realized he loved to write. He was good at it. And he grew up, and he also realized he loved his country. When he was 18 years old, after he graduated from high school, he went and served our country in Afghanistan. And unfortunately, he's gone from serving our country to serving a prison sentence for a crime he didn't commit. The photograph I've shown you not only corroborates that, but so does the physical evidence. That .38 caliber bullet Officer Sliviak told you he found, no match to Joe Mitchell's firearm. No match. Sergeant Pierce performed a paraffin test on Joe Mitchell that night, not only on his hands, but on his clothing. No traces of gunpowder. They never tested anything of Miss Thompson's. Instead, they took her word, her story, and started chasing the wrong man. They went off in the wrong direction. And to this day, that crime has not been properly solved. The prosecution still has work to do, and so does law enforcement, members of the jury. They haven't put this puzzle together. Their pieces simply don't fit. When you're deciding this case, it's important to remember the prosecution, they bear the burden, and their burden is to prove that Joe Mitchell, not only that he committed the crime he's been accused of, but that he premeditated the crime. First-degree murder is a very serious crime. You not only killed somebody if you committed first-degree murder, but you premeditated it, you thought about it, and you devised a plan. Nothing about Joe Mitchell's actions says he did that at all. They have not met their burden. And you hear this phrase, reasonable doubt. What does it mean? What does it mean if the prosecution has this burden to get to guilt beyond reasonable doubt? How do we get there? I can tell you how we don't get there. If you don't think Joe Mitchell's guilty, he's not guilty. If you even think maybe he's possibly guilty, I'm not really sure, he's not guilty. You may even have a strong belief he could be guilty. Maybe there's some evidence that says he could have done it. He's still not guilty. It's not until you get here, guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, where there's no doubt in your mind. And reasonable doubts, it's that feeling you have inside. It's that feeling about the evidence, about the testimony, when something doesn't add up. You know it with your mind, you feel it in your heart, and you sense it with your gut. Something's not right. Questions have not been answered. They have not met their burden of proof in this case. You're going to be given, it's called a verdict form, in a few minutes, after prosecution has a chance to speak to you one last time, because they bear the burden. This form asks you to simply state what the outcome, what your idea of the outcome should be. Do you find him guilty or not? And if you find him guilty, it has to be of first-degree murder. The evidence doesn't point to that at all. Where's my marker? I had a marker. And because the evidence simply doesn't point to Joe Mitchell, because the charges simply do not stand, when you get this form, you'll know exactly what to do. Wisdom is knowing what to do. Virtue is doing it. And when you get this form, you're going to mark not guilty. You're going to give the prosecution and law enforcement the opportunity to continue their journey to justice for Leslie Mitchell, to pin the crime on the right person and not make a rush to judgment based on misinformation, misdirection, and Miss Thompson. Thank you very much for your service and your patience in this case.
That was really good. Yeah, that was awesome.